It is always a gift when Julie can be with us. Thank you, Julie. All of our music today. On Thursday, for the second time, I had the honor of offering the invocation at the Walnut Creek Veterans Day observance. As Mayor Kevin Wilk began his welcome, I looked across the auditorium, which was COVID full, and that means it would have looked poorly attended in past years, but it looked super full today, kind of like today with us. I was struck by how much the holiday, which was once called Armistice Day and marked celebration of those of only one war, remains the location of our oldest veterans who was touched by the immediacy of war in our midst now is different, informed more now by economics than often by the mandatory assignment of a draft. What also struck me was how the program was less triumphant than the last time I had been there, which was probably about 6 or 7 years ago. There was more acknowledging of what those who experience war go through, and more focusing on the poignancy of this year because it is the 100th anniversary of the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown. I would like to invite right now any who are veterans among us to rise in body or spirit. Thank you for your service. And I'd like us to hold in our hearts today and maybe just take a moment to speak the names of those in our immediate circles who have served as veterans, who have served in war. Let's just say their names out loud to ourselves. Mark Matsushima, Doug Loveland, Jean Takahashi. As is customary at the end of the ceremony, the veterans were invited to stand by the branch of service, and as each did, it was with the expression that one sees at such occasions. It's one in which we just saw. It holds acknowledgement, perhaps some pride of having been here and as a survivor, and yet also a somber knowing that comes from having survived that which others cannot know. Only one woman in the Lesher Center stood on Thursday. I sought her out afterward to thank her for her service. And as I also sought out the 91-year-old World War II veteran who was in the front row as well. I wondered if others or more non-white veterans would have felt more welcomed this year with its nuanced acknowledgement of all that is held by those who return from war, including our more prolonged wars recently in Iran and Afghanistan. The bravery, courage, and sacrifice were noted, and also the hardship. For so often, the other place we see the label veteran these days is scrawled on hand-lettered signs, proclaiming those in economic need among us. So as I said in my invocation on Thursday, we would dream of a world without war. We would also dream of a world without violence and other forms of pain and suffering for that matter. Among those who stood on Thursday were no doubt those who had not only survived war, but they had survived its aftermaths, wrestled with its truths, and come to their own peace, the way our own Jim Hassey has described in his book, which we all should read, Warriors and Friends. And no doubt some have brought home their anger, their moral outrage, their trauma, and their fears, and passed them to the people around them, because that is how dirty pain works sometimes. And as the reading said from Rasma Menachem, whether we engage or not with the fullness of our experience will in part determine the nature of our pain. When we face the worst in the human experience, which we have had to do this week, which happens outside of wartime experiences as well, as we know, we can struggle with messages that we may somehow have imbibed unconsciously from our larger culture, which says that bad things happen because people somehow weren't living right, that good people don't have tragic things happen to them, or do tragic things in a moment of unhealth for that matter. We fight a sort of cultural Calvinism, which says that the depravity of human beings is overcome by a rigid belief in an order that we have to oppose on ourselves and that only some of us are good enough to attain. Now, our universalist heritage would argue against that. It's a counter to that particular argument. And it would say that people can't be divided into the dichotomy of good and bad, that we all live in the world as we do. And that gives us a much bigger religious challenge, my friends. It's a lot easier when you can say these people are bad and these people are good, and that's how it goes, right? So even acknowledging that spark of the divine that's our Unitarian kin would suggest actually is there somewhere, no matter how smothered within each of us, we have to know that there have been times when we ourselves have also missed the mark. I've always had this idea that we are all more than the worst thing we have ever done, civil rights lawyer Brian Stevenson said. It's one of my favorite quotes. We are better, and we are more likely to act from the better when we are willing to acknowledge where we've been, what we've seen, and how it has impacted us. Doing this allows us to be less judgmental of others and of ourselves, less fearful about those who have experienced difficult things among us, and more able to engage in genuine and healing community together. I am going to be teaching again this year at Stark King School for the Ministry, and one of my boss there actually, Dr. Gabriella Latini, is a native of Italy, and she writes of reading the international news one day and realizing that an account of violence from a veteran on his mother was she began to fear about her cousin and her aunt. And she contacted her uncle to learn that in fact she was right, that it was the story of her family that she was reading about from far across the sea. She writes, on that tragic day in June, I had been immersed in my work with the Truth Commission on conscience in war and moral injury. After hearing so many stories from veterans and their families, I was shocked by the news, but I could also make some sense of it. Earlier in my life, I might have felt ashamed that my family was in the newspaper as a classic example of the sad life of the poor and socially maladjusted. But I knew these news commentaries were no more than convenient explanations that hid the complex truths about what Italy calls peace missions and the outrageous lack of proper mental care for Italian veterans. You know, we could feel that same outrage today about the ways that an under-regulated pharmaceutical industry has perpetuated an opioid epidemic and the ways that economic inequality have perpetuated an addiction crisis for which limited remedies are available for those who cannot pay. And we could feel outrage at the cultural barriers that keep us from asking for help when things are hard, that school us that we should not ever show that vulnerability to others, which is often, that reach out, often, the first step in stopping a cycle of violence that may end up being fatal. Would that more of us would be willing to speak of those pains among us as well, to share our pain as we work to scrub it clean. We gather here together in the ways we do in different ways and different times now, with the ability to look at our wisdom as survivors of some events that perhaps we don't talk about often. There is a moment I will never forget in 2020 when I first saw the tented parking lot of Kaiser in the first months of the shelter in place. It was nighttime, and I was returning from church because we still had our guest in sanctuary on campus and we needed to bring her food. So I was on the streets when many were at home. To see the asphalt that I had crossed so many countless times covered by that giant, ominous tent, made me, for the first time, understand what it means to feel your blood run cold. Because I realized that despite what people were saying on the news, it wasn't just going to be 2 weeks and over, this thing that was happening among us. I knew in that moment that we were into something that was going to be much harder than we thought. And we are all here today because we have survived that. Latini, involved in the work of cleaning pain at the international level, said that that work helped her see the wisdom that survivors can hold. We know this. The wise person who has been through much but can be a guide for that which we need to see. This wisdom comes not from pushing pain aside, but rather from engaging with it, exploring its emotional riches. The people who laugh, cry, sharing remembrances of a beloved who has died, the resilience of the enslaved who offer us the transformative music, such as that which we entered into today, which invited us to guide our feet. When we are confronted by something hard, how easy it is to turn away from that pain and instead to enter into criticism of others, defensive anger, or perhaps over-intellectualizing, trying to figure out a reason that something happened that we really never will completely know. Our tradition says that we don't believe that bad things happen for some great karmic reason. And yet we do know that when bad things happen among us, and they have happened, my friends, we have an opportunity for what we will make of that. We may pass it through the fire of thought, as our forebearer Ralph Waldo Emerson encouraged us to do, and we may instead try to push it away under the table, and it may come back at some point. When people give voice to their experience, whether it's the loss of a loved one, a struggle against addiction, an experience of violence, or the impacts of war and combat, they can discover a new strength and a richness of truths within them that can allow them to be linked back to joy. We who would wish that the world would be a better vessel for peace and nonviolence can also accompany one another as we seek to mine whatever gold can be found from the straws of tragedy. Instead of uttering words that harm those in pain, such as all things happen for a reason, or extolling the virtues of positive thinking at a time when that is absolutely not possible for people, we can be the place where we just listen when someone needs to talk. When we are able to try to just be present instead of to need to reduce artificially another person's experience, we can become part of the wisdom that guides us through this messiness and unknowingness of life. In this way, we can be a place more blessed by the wisdom of survivors, those who, for no fault of their own, have experienced the worst that life can offer and still have chosen to return good to the world. Those who offer deep knowledge for uncertain times such as these, who scrub their pain clean, unwanted and undeserved though it may be. As we continue to reemerge together, to connect, and to look around to try to discover what this world is we are in now, I know we need the wisdom of survivors, the wisdom of all of us. Those who, no matter what life brings, in the words of the Reverend Rebecca Parker, choose to bless the world. May we make it so.